Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPhone 6 Plus and see how this specific iPhone holds up in 2023. Now, the one thing I'll definitely tell you is this iPhone actually means a lot to me because it was the first iPhone I actually ended up using as my main device. And I think I used it for about a year, and it was a pretty good time. I think I definitely had some other iPhones before that I used almost like iPods, but this was the first one that I actually put my SIM card in and actually used as my main device. Now, I probably wouldn't recommend buying this iPhone anymore, but if you do want to pick up some other ones I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPhone 6 Plus, on the front, we do have a pretty big 5.5-inch IPS LCD panel. It's a 1080p panel, and the funniest thing is, when you think of 5.5 inches now, that's not really that big of a screen size. I mean, I think the iPhone 12 mini and the 13 mini have like a 5.7-inch screen size or something like that, and that's a mini device, and that technically has a bigger screen than the Plus version, the biggest model of the iPhone at that moment back in 2014. Now, things were kind of measured, I think, a little bit differently back then, and you kind of have to keep that in mind. And there's also a lot more bezel on this thing, but it is kind of very interesting when you kind of think about how a mini phone now used to be like the biggest phone back then. Now, we do have a 60Hz panel here, nothing crazy, but this was a big departure of what Apple was doing before. They made a massive size phone pretty much to compete with the other massive size phones in the market, and I think this was a very smart choice from Apple. Unfortunately, with their first, kind of adoption to this market, they did take a massive loss by going through and having that Bendgate issue come up, but I do think regardless, this was a pretty good choice from Apple. You still have Touch ID on the front of this iPhone, which is great. And I definitely do think the front of this thing, it looks older, but I actually do like the way it looks for sure. On the bottom, we do have our Lightning port, which is awesome. We have our headphone jack here as well, which is really cool. And on the back of this iPhone, we do actually have our aluminum back. So I love this back. I feel like this iPhone, even like 10 years from now, will still feel like a very expensive phone, which I love, seeing. You do have the Apple logo right in the center. You do have the camera set up right in the top left corner as well, which is really cool. So you're not really missing out on too much, I would say, from like this generation and the, next one for sure. At least on the outside, they looked almost identical. But there were lots of changes the 6S Plus ended up bringing that kind of, dominated over the 6 Plus, to be honest. But when I look at the iPhone 6 Plus, I still feel like this iPhone looks very good. There's not too much to complain about. Unfortunately, with that Bendgate issue, basically, this iPhone would just basically like break in half almost. Like it was easily you could just fold this iPhone very easily. It was bendable. And because of that, this iPhone, kind of a lot of people didn't buy. I mean, a lot of people bought these iPhones, but the stigma behind these iPhones kind of got ruined. Like, these were the first big iPhones. These were like there were big changes for sure. But the problem was that, if your iPhone's going to bend and break in half, that the confidence of buying these iPhones just went down like crazy. And there were tons of people making videos about it at that time, I remember. And with an iPhone like this, I will be honest, you're definitely not going to be getting, a very, dependable iPhone in terms of, durability. It can break very easily, and there's no IP certification either. So that's kind of another thing to keep in mind here too. So to kind of, finish the body off, that was kind of a big issue that we were having with this iPhone. On the camera department side, on the back, we do have a single 8 megapixel standard camera, and on the front, we have a 1.2 megapixel standard camera. Now we can do 1080p on the back at 60 frames per second, which is nice. And on the front, we have 720p video. Now this camera really is not that great of a camera, and I think a lot of people probably know this. I mean, at that moment, maybe it was pretty good, but I even think back then, when I think back at the iPhones and Androids in 2014, there were a lot of phones that had really good cameras back in 2014 on the Android side. So I always thought that was like a really big deal in my opinion. With something like the iPhone 6 Plus, I definitely do think this camera was good back then, possibly. And I remember when I was using this phone, I had a pretty good time with the camera. I was using a bunch of applications at that moment, and I just kind of think back to myself about how big this phone was. So the viewfinder was really big, so it made the photos and videos just seem that much better and bigger, which is weird because you wouldn't think that, but that's kind of what I was thinking at that time, and that was what was super crazy about it. So in my opinion, from that perspective alone, I think a phone like the iPhone 6 Plus camera, again, it's not the first camera I would recommend buying anymore, but I do think it was kind of an interesting approach from Apple, because it seems like they didn't even upgrade the camera from the iPhone 5S, but they made it such a bigger phone, so they could have easily done it. I guess the 6S Plus kind of brought the most to the table there, but regardless, that's kind of how the camera held up. In the software department, this is probably the one area where this phone is not worth buying at all. This phone has been unsupported with software since iOS 12. So it has been years since this iPhone has gotten an actual OS upgrade, like a massive one. But this phone has been getting security updates for the last couple of years, which is crazy. I think that actually makes this the longest lasting iPhone of all time. So essentially what happened was this phone was, I think, officially kind of like dropped with support around 2019. So for the last couple of years, so since 2019 basically, I think it was 2019, this phone has been getting a bunch of security updates. So you wouldn't even think a phone like this Apple would keep supporting, considering it had so many like issues, but they are still supporting this type of iPhone, which is crazy in my opinion. And that just kind of showcases how long Apple will go ahead and basically support an iPhone for. And I think that makes owning an iPhone, at least in my opinion, it makes me feel a lot more confident about owning a device like this, because I know Apple's probably going to end up supporting it for quite a bit of time. So like I said, although I wouldn't recommend buying this phone anymore, it's still very interesting how Apple's still supporting this thing for so many years after. So I think that in and of itself is a very crazy thing for sure. Now, performance side, this phone had that Apple A8 chip inside of it, and it had 1 gigabyte of RAM. Now thinking about those types of specifications right now, you wouldn't believe how fast I thought this phone was at that moment. And I actually thought that the iPhone 6s Plus that I actually bought a little bit after was such a small upgrade coming from this specific device. But little did I know that was not quite the case. This phone was definitely it was a slower phone than the next generation, but it felt like a fast phone at that time because a lot of the applications. So with something like the iPhone 6 Plus, you are still getting, I think, a very interesting phone in the performance side. So it's not really a good performing phone anymore. And I think a majority of us will probably know that. Whenever I use my iPhone 6 Plus, it is a fairly slow mess. And to be honest, if you have something like the base iPhone 6 Plus like I had, you would not believe how annoying it is with storage issues. I am almost always running out of storage because I only have 16 gigabytes of storage. So constantly I have to delete stuff, and I have to even, like, iOS is a very not optimized system with storage either. So I'm always running out of storage on this device. But if you can get things loaded, I think it's an okay performing phone in like a very, very crazy scenario where you're still using this phone. But if you compare this phone, like if you had a chance of using this phone every day and then you switched over to something like an iPhone XR and you go back to an iPhone 6 Plus and you compare them, you would not believe how much faster, like it's 50 times faster on something like an iPhone XR than an iPhone 6 Plus. And the XR is already like a 5-year-old phone. So when you think about it like that, the 6 Plus I don't think is really a good performing phone anymore. It's very slow. The iPhone 6 is almost the same thing. But that's expected on a phone that's pretty much 9 years old as of this point. So I'm not even going to hate on the 6 Plus there because it is a fairly old phone. And the battery life situation too, I thought that battery life was very good for that time. And it's almost 3,000 milliamp hours. It's a pretty decent performing battery life in my opinion. But as I've stated for many years now, again, it's just not really worth buying anymore because of the other issues kind of plaguing this phone, especially that it's been unsupported with a long time. And that's kind of how I think about this iPhone. It's not really worth buying because it's been unsupported for a long, long period of time. So from that perspective, you're much better off buying something like an iPhone, XR, an iPhone 8 Plus if you need to. But I wouldn't recommend going down to an iPhone 6 Plus. And that kind of stuff doesn't make any sense to me at all. And that's kind of where I see this specific iPhone as of this point. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that will mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.